augsti godātie konferences dalībnieki, lūdzu ieņemiet savas vietas.
Hello, distinguished conference guests. Please take your seats. Let us start the second part of the conference. In the first plenary session, we had the possibility to discuss general directions. In the second part, we are going to look at the best practice provided by other countries so that we are able to implement the practices of other countries. I will give the floor to the participants of the panel, and I hope that prior to the lunch, we will be able to discuss it also with the audience. The first speaker will be John Halloran, Chief Executive of the European Social Network, and he will speak about promoting strategies for local inclusive communities. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me to address you today. I'd like to particularly thank the Latvian presidency, with whose government we've worked really for a couple of years now. I had the honour of being co-chair of the European Expert Group for the last couple of years, and also involved in the joint action, which was a year-long piece of work involving the development of country-based seminars to raise awareness of the issue of deinstitutionalisation, but also to share, if you like, the opportunity for the use of structural funds to make some important changes. And Latvia was the first country to host such a meeting. And from the beginning, a message was sent very clearly from your government that this was something to which you attached a lot of importance. And I'm delighted that together with Jan Pfeiffer, we were able to get involved in the first meeting, and then to come back with the European Commission to discuss the programme in a little bit more detail. And again, your government was represented in December in Brussels when we had the European Parliament meeting at the end of the joint action. So clearly there is a line of development, and it's a pleasure to be here today to reconnect with you. The European Social Network brings together those responsible for the planning and delivery of local public services in municipalities and regions, and also those responsible for the development of quality, inspection and improvement of services, including research. A number of universities and other institutes are also working with us. The message today, I think, is a very important one, not just in terms of the need to make an important transition from an inherited institutional approach to social welfare, but it's important in terms of the direction of travel. It's important for me, therefore, in my short presentation this morning, to talk about DI within a dynamic societal framework, a local inclusive community. Of course, we use these terms sometimes rather too liberally without perhaps thinking what they might mean. For me, it's a question of answering the question, who are you and where do you belong? Where do you come from? Where do you associate yourself? Your town, your rural area, your village, your country? Nowadays on Facebook and on other channels, people often exchange information about their school, their growing up period. So it's about your identity, where you belong, your school, your local doctor, market that you go to at the weekend, maybe church, where you work with your colleagues and socialize afterwards, culture and sport, shared memories, shared history, local coffee bar, the cinema, the pub. It's about belonging and being somewhere. That's what local community is about. Something we take for granted. But many people for whom we provide protection and care cannot take this for granted because they actually don't belong to our community. And what does the word inclusive mean? It's interesting when you look at the mission of the ERDF and EDF funding, it's not just about social services, is it? It's about creating sustainable communities. So inclusive for me is for everyone. Everyone being visible, everyone counting, building in access, support, recognition for everyone. Those with disabilities, those from ethnic minorities, gender, sexual orientation, a recognition that everybody belongs, that everybody has a contribution to make. I'd like to just tell you a short story. This is something that happened to me about 3 weeks ago. It was lunchtime on a Sunday, and I took my kids to a concert. It was a short 1-hour lunchtime concert with some Brazilian music in my local town. And it was really quite a lively concert, and typical of my family, we always got there late. So the lights were out, and we had to sort of sneak in somewhere half up the rows. And I noticed during the concert there was a young boy in front of me, probably about 7 or 8 years of age, who was jumping up and down. The music was clearly getting to him. He loved it. And there was a lot of enthusiasm because there were kids, adults, all kinds of people were there, all ages. And when the lights went on and when the concert finished and the boy turned round, I realized he was blind. And I also realized the number of disabled people in that concert hall. Now, there's no reason why I should have noticed that in a way, because this was not a special concert. Nobody made reference to inclusion. Why should they? It was just an ordinary Sunday concert. And I mentioned it to my kids. My kids said, "So what's the fuss, Dad? There are disabled people in my school." But actually, it astonished me, and it shouldn't have, because as a social worker many years ago, I had grown up in an environment where institutions were the norm. And it was only later on, as a consultant, I helped to close some of the institutions. And it was more of an aspirational feeling that someday things might be different. And it was nice to have a moment in time to look around and realize, actually, things are not perfect, but they've moved on quite a long way. Things seem to be ordinary, as they should be, not special. So, a local inclusive community. Is that beyond our reach? I think it's something we should be thinking about. Not just in terms of the technical responsibilities that you all have in your own particular fields, but in terms of the bigger picture that you want to share with your colleagues, with your citizens, with your users, with your community. But this isn't easy, is it? Many of us don't think this way, actually. Many in our government don't think this way. Many professionals don't think this way. Maybe some of us here don't really think this way. Maybe we think this is actually not really realistic, that people cannot be really independent. Maybe we're not convinced that this is a risk worth taking. Many of those that we heard in the last presentation, the families and carers and parents of those with disabilities, were themselves not very convinced. In fact, sometimes were the least convinced. So there are some issues that we need to address. If we look at our TV, if we look at our cultural environment, if we look at education, if we look at sport, how far are they inclusive? And we've all made mistakes. In the deinstitutionalization process, in some countries, we have closed institutions without establishing first decent community infrastructure. And that has meant that people have suffered. People have been returned to their families who were unable to cope. So we have to learn from that. But let's move forward and let's be ambitious. Let's set the bar high. Let's not just aim to close some institutions, let's aim to close all institutions. Let's aim to put in place a plan which is not just de-something, but pro-community. A plan we share with others, a real strategy. I was talking to a minister, not from your country, I hasten to add, who told me that it would take at least 30 years to close the institutions. Well, that's a real shame, isn't it? Because if it's going to take 30 years, actually, it'll never happen. We need to give people choice and control. It's been said earlier. But that means really quite a lot. It means something that actually many professionals feel nervous about. It means sharing power. It means taking on an assessment of needs together with people and their families and their carers. It means being transparent. It means understanding people's lives. It means seeing people as assets. And it's not just on an individual basis. It must be on the whole way in which services are designed. If you want to design a service, think of those who should use it. For example, think that you have 2 pairs of steps here when you might want to have a disabled person come up the front of the stage. Give people choice and control. Listen to them. I remember doing a film, 2010, which was the year of combating poverty, and it involved interviewing people in a day centre and for intellectual disabilities. And what struck me when I was there was that staff said that people didn't know how to choose. They hadn't been used to choosing. They needed help with choosing. It was not part of the curriculum. I mean, what do you choose? Everything is actually organised for you. So learning to choose was quite a big issue. But it's fundamental to living as a citizen. And we've heard earlier that that will actually mean you use your own budgets, you make your own choices, you're treated as a partner, you're treated as an equal. So we need to involve people and their carers. We often forget carers, but we need to involve both. And we need to involve them in every decision that concerns their lives. And that means also they need to be able to complain. And that's fundamental. And it's something that we do, I think, in services from time to time, but not systematically. And it's something we need to build in. Build in a normal environment that we actually involve people in every decision of their own lives. And beyond that, involve them in decisions about our lives. You see, this is not just a passive, active relationship. This should be an equal relationship. People may well have something to say about how we live, how we run our services, how we train as professionals, how we evaluate our own services. People have something important to say there, not out of the kindness of our heart, but because they have an important contribution to make. I think there's a need for a cultural change here. Do you not think so? This will require skills. Skills for all kinds of people. One of the sad things about our services, particularly home care, community care services, they are generally in many countries low status, low pay, low training. And yet they're frontline, fundamental, the most important glue in supporting a community infrastructure. We need to do something about that, to find ways of training up, upskilling, and actually investing more in those who care directly for some of the most vulnerable in our society, who help them to live independently, who help people to live longer in their communities. We need to upskill our professionals, our social workers, our doctors, our teachers, and where possible, train them together. Our tradition of training in many professions has been to train at university or maybe post-university and then leave it for the next 40 years. Actually, no. If we're going to make a transformation here, we actually have to upskill all of us all the time. And the third area for me is those who manage or plan the services. In some situations, we have called them traditionally administrators, people who make sure you don't overstep the budget. Well, actually, what we need now are leaders, people who are going to bring about change and are going to help their own professionals make that important change too. Managing change is one of the key demands of the next 10 years. And finally, we need to look at those who use our services, help them to be upskilled. As I said, in many areas now, service users are some of the most important assets a community can have. They're not the recipients, they actually are the determinants. So let's try and upskill all of us. There are key words that have changed over the years. I think someone said earlier that, I think it might have been Jan, in terms of the changes in our society, institutions were seen as cutting edge. the sort of 19th century, 20th century social reforms. This was about protecting people. We're now talking a different language about leadership, public management, social and economic planning, housing, transport, quality of life. So let's get started. My message is be ambitious, be strategic, be inclusive. And let me give a message about what I think inclusive is about. When the next planning application comes to your local council or to your government, whether it's for a car park or a supermarket or a hotel or a school or repairing the pavement in the street, think inclusive. The next public procurement process, whatever it's for, think inclusive. When you're thinking about consulting your citizens, think how they're going to do that. Think inclusive. The next time a new school is planned, think inclusive. If we don't think inclusive now, we'll leave this process to those in a fairly narrow field. I don't mean narrow in terms of culture, those of us here, those who are committed, those who are convinced. We know what we're doing, or we think we do, but there's a whole world out there that needs to be brought together. It's been mentioned earlier that if you can't access health services, education, transport, housing, how are you going to actually transform our society from one which still regards social welfare as an institutional issue to one which is actually an inclusive issue? So I think the message is actually, if we're going to get started, we have to involve a wider constituency than is probably here. And that's really key. Because if you can't get from one place to the other, then essentially you're institutionalizing people in the community. And I think I was interested in the results from the Norwegian survey just before the coffee break, which said that whilst a lot of progress has been made, I think, in the development of housing, and in fact that was a very ambitious target that was set, when it came to participation in a wider community, progress had been more difficult. And my suggestion from my own experience is that that was maybe because the range of stakeholders was relatively limited. Were the doctors involved? Were the planning authorities involved? Were the transport people involved? If not, we risk losing the opportunity we have today, tomorrow, this month, next year. It's happening all around us. Let's connect these people in and think inclusive. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Paldies Halloran kungam par sniegto ietvaru.
Thank you very much, Mr. Halloran, for this discussion and for this call to think inclusive. Now I would like to give the floor to Dr. Iris Arens, an analyst of policy challenges in employment, labor and social affairs, and she'll speak on mental health and work and challenges and policy developments. Over to you, please.
Thank you for your kind words of introduction, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present here. In this couple of minutes I will present to you. I hope to be able to show you that when we want to improve the social inclusion and social participation of people with mental health problems, the role of work is paramount. We know that work contributes to good mental health, but we also know that work can improve the recovery process of people with mental health problems. As such, it is very important, if we want to improve or include more people with mental health problems into work, that it is part of social policy. So I will first give you a little bit of background information on the work the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, has been doing on this topic. And I will then show you some figures that show how poorly the labor market participation is actually of people with mental health problems. And then I will go into the policy changes we think are necessary to improve this further. So in 2010, a mental health and work review team started at the OECD, and they delivered the first report in 2011, which was called Sick on the Job, Myths and Realities about Mental Health and Work. And in this report, we summarized the evidence that is there showing the labor market outcomes of people with mental health problems, and it also built the case for why policy action is needed in this field. Following this, we reviewed 9 specific countries in the OECD and looked at their policies that they have in place to support labor market participation of people with mental health problems. And we also conducted a synthesis report that was published in March this year, which was called Fit Mind, Fit Job, in which we synthesized actually the problems that a lot of countries are experiencing in improving the labor market participation. And we also provided recommendations for how to get to policy transformation. So let me now present to you some data that show why it is so important to focus on the ability of people with mental health problems to participate in work, and why this should be a priority for social policy. So first of all, research into the costs of mental ill health has shown that these are enormous for society. On average, about 3.5% of the GDP, a country's GDP, is spent on mental ill health. And more importantly, the majority of these costs are not due to healthcare, but more to productivity loss, so the indirect cost, such as, for example, work disability, sickness absence, and unemployment. And this chart actually shows us 2 things. On the one hand, a positive message, because it shows that of the people with mental health problems, at least the majority or even more are found in work. So this also means that the workplace can be an important area for intervention. On the other hand, a bit more negative message is that still the employment gap is relatively large if you look at the difference between the people without mental health problems and those with. Even those with moderate mental disorders have a 15% employment gap compared to those without. And if you look at people with more severe mental health problems, the employment gap even reaches up to about 30%. And next to this employment gap, we also see that the risk of unemployment is much higher for people with mental health problems. Depending on the severity of the problems, the risk of unemployment can be 2 to even 5 times higher. So maybe not surprisingly, we see that a lot of people with mental health problems end up on benefits. So this chart shows you for 4 different countries the share of people that experience mental health problems in different benefit systems. So we talk about disability benefits, but also sickness benefits, unemployment benefits, and also social assistance benefits. In all these cases, the share of people, the benefit recipients that are experiencing mental health problems is about 25%, and sometimes even reaching 50 to over 50% of the people. So this is a huge group. And maybe even unfortunately, the large group that is still able to be in work is also showing problems to stay at their workplace. The group of people with mental health problems is much more likely to experience sickness absence, but maybe even more concerning is the right chart, which shows you the people with mental health problems that are at the workplace, but mention that they experience problems to conduct their work. So we see that even those with mild to moderate mental health problems, 7 out of 10 people say that it's difficult to perform their work. And this difference is extremely big also if you compare to the group without mental health problems. So this actually shows that employers can also play an important role in the lives of people with mental health problems. So to summarize, it's clear that in many OECD countries, people with mental health problems have problems to participate in work. They are less often found in work, but when they are in work, they also struggle to remain in work. So in our reports, we looked at what some countries have been doing or trying to improve the labor market outcomes of people with mental health problems, and how their policies try to support these people. And we also looked at in what way policies might be improved. So what we concluded is that actually 3 shifts are needed. First of all, a shift in when is intervened. So at this moment we see that action often comes very late when problems have reached a very high complexity. There's also a shift needed in who intervenes. At this moment, the mental health care system is largely seen as the big party responsible for people with mental health problems. But there's also a shift needed in how is intervened, because the different sectors that are working with people with mental health problems are also often remaining in their own silos. So in the following and my last slides, I will go into these 3 points and show you what kind of policy transformation we think is needed, and also give you some examples from other OECD countries, how they have tried to take some first steps in realizing this. So, as I said, early action is needed for people with mental health problems. We often see that action comes at a point that people have ended up on disability or have become institutionalized, while action should take place in a much earlier phase when problems have not reached such a high complexity. So there are some examples of countries that have tried to take a first step in this regard. So I will not mention them all, but just highlight 2 of these. So for example, in Switzerland, we see that employers and employees with mental health problems can already contact the Social Security Institute before an employee has really ended up there on disability. So it's still when an employee is within the work context. And the Social Security Institute can provide help with work adjustments, but also by providing courses, for example, if that would be helpful. To either colleagues or the employer or supervisors. So this is a way of already being proactive before people end up on a disability benefit to intervene early. Another area where it is really important to intervene early is among young people, because we know that young people with mental health problems or difficulties have a much higher chance to have problems to transfer from school to work. So there's a specific example in Australia is where they try to provide actually a whole school approach, general mental health promotion for all children. This is called Kids Matters. This is the program for children in primary schools, and the Mind Matters program is for children in secondary schools. So here they try to provide social-emotional skills training for the young people, but also provide good information to teachers on how to deal with students that might have first signs of mental health problems, to really also be able to act early if these first signals occur. So, and then with regards to who should intervene, we think a more important role could be placed at the frontline actors. So with that we mean actually people who work with people with mental health problems on a regular or even day-to-day basis, such as the teachers, as just mentioned, but also employers, specifically supervisors, but also general practitioners. And we often see that these frontline actors not often have the knowledge of the impact of mental health problems on the lives of these people, and also on their ability to participate in school, but also in work. But they also have a little awareness of where they could refer people to, and what kind of first support they could be able to provide themselves. But we do see some countries that are trying to take steps to improve this. For example, in Australia, there's an extra mental health training, like extracurricular, for general practitioners. They even have a basic extra training, but also more specialized training. And if GPs have gone through this training, they are getting extra compensation when they provide mental health support to their patients. And actually about 80% of the general practitioners has already taken such kind of extra education. Another example is again from Norway, where they have the information centers on mental health and work. These are specifically for employers. So in these centers, information is provided to employers, supervisors on the stigma attached to mental health, and also about what kind of support services are available that they could refer their employees to. But at the same time, employers can also actively contact these centers themselves if they have an urgent situation for which they would like to get some advice. So, and then finally, we see that the way in which people with mental health problems are supported by the different sectors or systems involved is not going in a very coordinated or integrated way. People with mental health problems often suffer from multiple problems, not only their health-related problems, which are not only mental health, but often also there's comorbidity with physical illness. But next to that, as said, they can experience work-related problems, but also family problems like divorce or debts. So this means that a lot of different systems are involved in supporting these people, but we often see that these systems work within their own framework and do not communicate very well with each other. And the risk of this is that people do not receive all the care that they would actually need to receive, or that some types of care are coming in at a late stage, actually maybe sometimes too late. So, for example, in some countries where they're trying to get to more integrated ways of care, is in England, where they have specific centers for mental health care. They provide mainly cognitive behavioral therapy for people with mental health problems, often people who are not yet on disability allowance, but who are still in work. Maybe they are on sickness absence, but they still have connections with the work environment. And they've decided to, in these centers for mental health support also put in employment advisors. So these employment advisors ensure that while people are getting mental health treatment, are also receiving support in how they can be able to remain at work or return back to work. So these are really also, in most cases, co-located within the centers. And another example is in Belgium, where the Social Security Institute has tried to bring together 3 different parties. Specifically, they work with a job coach, an empowerment coach, which is actually a social worker, and a health coach, which is most often a psychologist. And they together support people with mental health problems who are unemployed to make sure that they are able to get into employment. So it's really a collaborative process in which they discuss together the case and decide how they can also adjust each other's actions to make sure that all kinds of support is delivered in a timely way and coordinated way. So to conclude, we can say that the importance of work for people with mental health problems, but also the poor labor market outcomes at this moment of people with mental health problems has been neglected for a long time, but that we also see some first good examples of countries that are trying to get to a way of policy delivery that is timely and also in an integrated way and close to the environment of the people themselves. So, thank you very much for listening.
Paldies Ārences kundzei par šo iespēju.
Thank you, Ms. Arends, for introducing us to these good examples. I must say that mental health is something we know that it is important, but very often we do not know how to better proceed and what can be done about it. And thus, experts, specialists very often combat the consequences instead of dealing with the early stage, as well as the problem of stigmatization. In Latvia, for instance, the psychiatric aid is not very friendly to patients, which is the reason why people address these specialists in a belated manner or do not do it at all. We will have the possibility to continue discussing it after lunch. Now we will give the floor to Ms. Michelle Livesley. She's going to speak about person-centered approach in social service delivery.
Delighted to be here to talk about some of the how. How do we put people at the heart of service delivery? And I had the privilege in the 80s of helping move some people out of institutions back in the UK. And I was very passionate and very excited to be doing that. I felt a little bit like a knight in shining armour, but I was also very naive, because what I realised really quickly was liberating people from big institutions does not necessarily mean that they become part of their community. And I would actually describe the people that I resettled into community, into lovely areas, in lovely houses, as tourists in their community. A little bit like me yesterday, wandering around Riga as a tourist, taking in the sights, but no sense of connection, no sense of belonging, no sense of being missed if I wasn't there any longer. So I learnt an awful lot about thinking about people being in community and what good services can do to help think about that as well. In the UK, we're using personal budgets to help people have more control and choice over their services. And actually, just having a budget doesn't do it either. Just having a budget and knowing how much your services cost doesn't necessarily mean that the service will be tailored around your individual needs. So these are some really good checks that help give us guidelines around what does good actually look like. Because we have to start at that point about, if we know what good looks like, we can analyse how well we're doing. So good is the what. So can the person use their hours or budget flexibly and choose exactly what they're supported with? Where can the person choose where they're supported and where it makes sense for them, whether that's at home or in the community? Who? Can people choose who provides that support? Or does a service do that for them? How do we involve people in that important thing about who touches me, who supports me, who spends part of every day with me? The when is also important, so rather than being slotted into timescales that are convenient to the service, can the person choose the times and the days that matter to them to get the most out of their lives? How? Can the person choose how they're supported and not just say what the support is, but determine what that looks like from their perspective? And would their staff, would their supporters know why it's important to them as well? And then finally, is that person involved in all decisions about their life? And do we gather information from that person that helps us to think about developing the service based on that? So we call that co-production. Are we listening to people who use services to determine how we develop our services? There are some person-centered thinking tools that can help us to do this. They're practical and they're really simple, but they help us have person-centered conversations that stop us coming at it from a professionals knows best approach, which is certainly how I started in my career, thinking I had loads of good ideas. But actually, the people I work with taught me different really, really quickly. We can use person-centered practices such as one-page profiles, understanding people's communication and supporting them with decision-making. Even if people don't use words typically to communicate, we can listen to their behaviour, we can listen to those who know and love them, we can best guess with integrity and check that out. Do staff know what good support looks like? Are they clear about their roles and responsibilities and where they can use their initiative as well as they're learning about how best to support the person? We can review our support and services in a really robust way that puts the person at the centre. And we can do a better job at matching the staff to support the person as well. And are we introducing mindful learning into the very daily support that we're delivering with people? If we're doing this, we can capture all of this information and use co-production to then not only evaluate our services, but to shape service design. We believe that this starts with understanding what matters to people. So, very fundamental concept. Do we know what matters, what's important to somebody, and what good support looks like? But not just the people who use the services. What about the workforce as well? Are we listening to how we can support them better too? So the question is, can we deliver personalised, person-centred services without knowing what matters to people and how best to support them from their perspective? The answer has to be no. We have to start by understanding what matters to folk. Historically, we've focused on how to keep people healthy and safe and not always thought about why that's a good idea, what makes life worth living in the first place. So there's an absence of what gives me joy and fulfillment, what makes life worth living, what gets me up in the morning, what helps me to achieve my potential. If we have an absence of that, then we're helping people make decisions based on poor information. So a one-page profile is a foundation for helping us to think about what matters to people. Now, this should start by itself, but it hasn't. Oh, yes, it has.
It's a page of information about you. It usually has 3 sections: an appreciation section about your qualities, what's important to you, and the support and help you might need from others. A one-page profile reflects the balance of what's important to and for someone. For example, my 13-year-old daughter Laura loves chocolate. It's definitely important to her. But as her parent, I have to try and balance what's important for her to have healthy teeth and to limit the amount of fat and sugar she has in her life. Therefore, chocolates on her list are what's important to her, and the section about her support reflects the balance we've negotiated of no more than 2 treats a day. Historically, our health and social care services have emphasised what's important for people, focusing on what it takes to keep people healthy and safe. Personalisation brings this back into balance. People are the expert in their own lives, and we must know and pay attention to what matters to people and deliver support in the context of how people want to live their life. So personalisation starts with a one-page profile. It's the first foundation stone of personalised services. You cannot deliver personalisation without knowing what's important to the person and how they want to be supported. It can start at birth and can continue to the end of your life. Flo is the youngest person that I know to have a one-page profile. Her one-page profile was created when she was just 3 months old. Her family used it to share with grandparents when they were babysitting, and the team around Flo, providing her and her family with additional support, used it as a way to get to know Flo quickly. And it was also how Flo was introduced to nursery. What would it be like if one-page profiles were used throughout schools and workplaces and health and social care? We're starting to see some of this happening in the UK. Can you imagine having a one-page profile for your child at school? What if information about how people valued your child and recognised their gifts and talents was recorded and updated every year? What if the curriculum reflected what really mattered to your child and every teacher knew exactly the best ways to provide support? Well, in one mainstream primary school, this is happening with every child and for the teachers as well. What about work? What if your employee and the team you worked with knew and had contributed to what they liked and appreciated about you? What if they knew what really mattered to you as an individual and how to support you to work at your best? What difference could that make to your work experience? Well, some national organisations are doing this and also seeing a reduction in staff turnover as well. What could this mean as we move towards personalising healthcare? What would life be like if you went into hospital and the first sheet of your notes was a one-page profile? How would your experience of hospitals be different if nurses knew you as a person and could talk to you about what mattered to you? And also ask at admission what would make your hospital stay work well, particularly for you. Not what you'd expect for everyone, not about everybody being listened to and treated with respect, but the best ways to share information with you and the best ways to involve you in decisions. You might be thinking, I don't want everyone to know everything about me. Well, of course, you'd only share personal information that you were happy to. For example, I'm really happy for you to know that I have 3 teenage daughters. I'm a black belt in karate. I have a flock of 7 hens who lay eggs periodically. I'm a morning person and rarely stays up past 10:30. And I get so excited about work that I have problems sleeping. I love single malts, especially those from Islay, but I'm equally obsessed about black teas as well. But there's information that I wouldn't want you to know in detail. For example, my family's experience of cancer, unless that was directly related to the support you were giving me. What if there was an app for this and you could develop your own one-page profile and share it with whoever you wanted? So does knowing more about me and other people change things? Yes, I think it does. Conversations start in a different place. They're even more powerful when this is reciprocated. Imagine the first time you met a new social worker and they introduced themselves by sharing their one-page profile with you. Because that's what personalisation is all about. It's a change in power. It's a different way to listen to people. It's a different way to work together and to pay attention to how people want to live their lives, not just keeping people safely with professionals in charge. So if your job is anything to do with personalisation and you don't start with a one-page profile, where will you start?
Meet Jenny. Jenny has a great sense of humour. Jenny is affectionate, she's honest, she's determined, and she's incredibly fun to be with. Jenny also has autism, and we started to plan with Jenny when she was still at school because her mum and family and circle of support were worried about what would happen to her in the future. About when she got into adult services, and they were worried about her going into an unsuitable living arrangement, sharing with people who it might not work with her, and people really not understanding how to support her well. Jenny's one-page profile was developed to capture the priorities of what mattered to her and the priorities of how best to support her. And I don't expect you to be able to read all the detail in the audience, but some of the things that are important to Jenny are always having a working iPod and iPad at all times, never letting the battery run out, having drinking straws to twiddle with, and having leaflets to flap. Really important to her quality of life and well-being. Also important for her and how best to support her is to give her space and time when she's doing anything so that she doesn't become flustered or anxious about it. Also to use a visual aid around communication so that she understands what's happening now and next. So a one-page profile captures kind of the executive summary of a person. It's not everything there is to know about someone, but if I was suddenly to go in and support Jenny, I'd do no harm, and I wouldn't get lost in files and files of paperwork trying to find the essence of the person that I was supporting. Starting to support Jenny early doors when she was young helped to plan a successful transition from childhood to adulthood. There's lots of planning happened, and we use person-centred reviews every 6 months with Jenny and her provider. Jenny now has her own home, a flat that she lives in, with a dedicated team around her who support her in what we call not a person-centred way, but a Jenny-centred way. That happened because we captured person-centred information with her and also collaborated and liaised with professionals who understood why things were important to Jenny and worked hard to make sure that she got the right support. Another tool that we use is matching. A huge impact on anybody's daily life is who we spend time with. And if we don't have choice or control over who that is, it can have a negative impact on us. Meet Winifred. Winifred is warm-hearted, loving, and lights the room up with her smile. That's how people who know and care about Winifred describe her. Winifred also has dementia and lives in a residential care home with 43 other people who also live with dementia. And when we first met Winifred, she was on her knees crying at the gates of the residential care home where she was living. She was confused and she was anxious. And staff who cared about her very much described that this was becoming more and more common, that she was confused and anxious. So we sat down with her staff team and with her 2 daughters and started to look at what mattered to Winifred and how could we get some of that back in this institution that she was living in. And one of the things that came up was that Winifred, when she was at her best, when she was at her absolute peak, was the most house-proud person you could ever imagine and loved nothing better than cleaning and presenting her lovely home. And she had no opportunities to do that in the institution that she now lived in. So the team there and the manager looked at how they could make that happen, and they created some dedicated time, only once a month, to help think about that. And they matched her to Beryl. Beryl is the housekeeper, who also has a shared love of cleaning, luckily. And they matched her to Winifred, and they looked for dedicated opportunities for Winifred to have a leading role in keeping the home clean and tidy. This rubbed off on all the other staff as well, and they saw that they could change their practice without asking for more money for resources, without changing policy, but just by doing things differently with the time that they had. And any time you went into the home, you would see that Winifred had things to do that helped her with her need to clean. So she would always have washing to fold up. She would always have a duster in her hand. And when we reviewed her service and her life, her daughters said that they'd seen a decrease in her confusion, that they'd seen her have purpose again, and that they'd seen her have joy again. She also started helping other people in the same situation too. So matching was a good thing to do there. But Beryl also said that she got more out of her job because she was matched to Winifred. We also have to ask if people have the opportunity to review their life and services and make changes, even when people don't use words to communicate. And the person-centred review process helps us to do that. It's a meeting that's held that the person is in charge of, and we start to think about what matters to the person and are they getting it. We also look at their aspirations for the future, and we create person-centred outcomes, and we create actions that move towards the person getting the life that they want. This helps the provider to make local changes that they have control over to adjust the support that they're giving, thereby tailoring their support. It also hears from other people who know and care about the person, so we create an agenda that's full and helps us to think about balance in the person's life as well. But we also think then about how can we support people to influence the service, and we use co-production to do that. So co-production, we would describe as a process called working together for change. And working together for change helps us to gather information from a person's support plan, or a person-centred plan, or a person-centred review. And we capture 6 pieces of information. What are the 2 things that are most important to each individual? And what are the 2 things that are most working? What are the 2 things that are least working, and what 2 things are important for the future? And then we aggregate that information with all the other people who use the service, and we think about what can the service do differently now to embed what's working further into their service delivery. What do they need to do strategically to address what's not working for people? And how do they need to plan for the future to give people what they say they want for the future? So we can get individuals contributing to large-scale service delivery and structural change by listening to them at ground level. But doing all this and having all these processes, again, doesn't make change unless we think about culture and we invest in the very staff who are delivering the support, and we build in their resilience and we pay attention to their well-being as well. And again, one-page profiles are a really quick and easy way to do this because we capture what matters to the person. Steve is the chief executive of a very large national provider in the UK, and in their organisation, every single person who uses services has a person-centred support plan, with the top page being a one-page profile. But so does every member of staff and volunteer, because knowing what matters is for everybody, and sharing what matters is for everybody. He also believes that being person-centred is just a standard that everybody should achieve. He wants to know what else the staff bring to the table, what from your personal life. So if I was being interviewed by Steve, he would be asking me, what else can I contribute? And I'd be saying, I'm really good at Scrabble. Brilliant. I'm a passionate gardener, but I don't know much about plants. And I love my grandchildren, and we'll talk about them all day. So I'm bringing something extra to the table. There are benefits of staff having a one-page profile. We get to match them to people and to tasks so that we're better utilising gifts and skills. We celebrate people's diversity and contribution. We create different opportunities for having conversations with one another and with the people we support, thereby deepening our relationships with people. We can personalise the very rotas that we're delivering as well. And then finally, well, almost finally, we need to think about measuring what we're doing. And I work with lots of provider organisations, and not one of them has ever said to me, we're not person-centred, Michelle. Every single one of them has said we're person-centred, and that's because it's a huge umbrella term. That's it's a bit up in the air. We need to be able to break that down into bite-sized chunks so we can measure it properly. When I manage services, if you'd have asked me if we were person-centred, I'd have said yes. In fact, I'd have said hell yes. If you'd have said, how person-centred are you at creating person-centred plans, score yourself 1 to 5, I'd have said, I think we're a 4, because we've been doing it a long time, and we've been improving how we do it. If you'd have said, how person-centred are you at people choosing the staff who support them, score yourself 1 to 5, I'd have said 2. There's a long way to go on that yet. So using this self-assessment tool called Progress for Providers helps managers look at their services and break it down into bite-sized chunks, prioritise the work that they need to do and build on what they're doing well already. So leadership is a key part in this, and we have to be able to measure progress. So it's not enough to say that we're person-centred, we have to see how well we're doing with that as well. If we do that and we use the tools that I've described, such as one-page profiles, person-centred reviews, working together for change, and Progress for Providers, it's a win-win situation because we're supporting the people who use services in a person-centred way, and we're building the resilience of our workforce. Thank you.
Paldies, Livslijas kundzei.
Thank you, Ms. Lively, for a very inspiring message. I can say on my part that our association, ZELDA, was the one that introduced Latvian specialists to these methods. We have been continuing this education, and starting from this year, our association is using these methods, applying in decision-taking. They have helped me answering important questions as how to communicate with people who, for instance, do not verbally communicate their needs. Very often, this method helps to see that we haven't actually clarified what is important to the person. There is no balance between what is important to the person personally and what is important from the medical healthcare point of view. These methods help creating a circle of assistance. It is very important for people who have been in institutions for years. Very often, since their childhood, they do not have a natural support network. It needs to be created from zero. Thus, I'm very happy that these methods in Latvia are being learned not only by ZELDA, but also other institutions and associations. The next speaker will be Georgette Mulher, Chief Executive of Lumos organization. She will speak about good practice in developing the system of foster families, guardians, and guest families for children. The floor is yours.
It's a great honour to be here. At the risk of repeating what others have said, I am utterly delighted, and we are delighted, that Latvia chose deinstitutionalisation as one of its priorities for its presidency of the European Union. So you may hear an English accent, but I'm a very proud European citizen. I am really proud of what we do together inside the Union and what we do internationally. And I think that the work that's been done over the last 5 or 6 years to really put this issue onto the agenda, to put money in the right direction, and to start to learn from each other is a fabulous example of the cooperation between nations, between professionals that really we should all celebrate as part of the Union. So, political message over. I run Lumos, which is an international children's organisation, and our mission is working with many other partners to ensure an end to the institutionalisation of children globally by 2050. We are one of the founder members of the European Expert Group, and you've heard from a number of other colleagues today, and I'm sure you will later as well. And this has been a very powerful group that has made big difference, a huge difference on this issue of ending institutionalisation for the groups that were mentioned by Jan Jarjab earlier on. I was asked to focus on the issue of foster care, and I am going to do that, but I need to put that into the context of what we mean by ending institutionalisation, or that terrible, terrible word deinstitutionalisation that is so hard to say no matter what your mother tongue. The first thing is that we need to remember that it's a global problem. When we focus on it in our own countries or even in the European Union, we have a tendency to be a bit inward-looking at, and imagining that we're the only ones suffering this or struggling to do something about institutionalisation. But actually, the best evidence available suggests that there are 8 million children in institutions around the world, and most people call these institutions orphanages, and the reason we reject that term is because across the world, more than 80% of those children have living parents, and in the European region, it's more than 90%. These are not orphans. These are children with parents, and there are a number of primary reasons why they're admitted to institutions, and we find that across the world, in low, middle, and high-income countries, the primary reason is poverty, and the secondary reason is disability and a lack of access to services and discrimination in the community. And the third reason we find is children who come from ethnic minority communities that are discriminated against and, again, are struggling to access services. So this map just shows you a few countries across the world to just give you that sense of numbers in a number of different countries. It's very hard to get good data, but we see, in Russia, probably somewhere around 600,000 children, and 95% of those are not orphans. In Indonesia, there are an estimated 500,000, and again, 94% not orphans. Even if we look at a country like Haiti, somewhere in the region of 32,000 children in institutions, and most people imagine that those children are there because they were orphaned as a result of the earthquake 5 years ago. Well, it's true that the institutions in Haiti have proliferated since the earthquake, but the children in them are not orphans. They are there because of grinding poverty and a lack of access to services. I know that most people in the room know this, so I'll just run through it very quickly, but the science proves very clearly the harm caused by institutions to all groups of people. But there's a particular issue for children, and particularly for babies, and that is a serious impairment of early brain development for babies raised in institutions. We also see the UN's Global Study on Violence Against Children 10 years ago found an increased risk of all forms of abuse for children in institutions compared with their peers, and again, that was the same across low, middle and high-income countries. We see a significantly increased mortality risk, and especially for disabled children. I'm going to come back to that. And for those children who do survive the childhood in institutions and grow up, we see extremely poor outcomes when they are adults. So I don't know if everybody here is aware of the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. If you're not, I strongly recommend you take a look at it, because for those of us who've worked with institutionalised children for a long time, it was such a relief. That might sound odd, but it was a relief to see this research and to see the harm caused to the brains of infants in institutions, because what was going on in the brain chemistry explained what we saw in the behaviours and the developmental delays of these children. And this became probably the strongest evidence we have to say that we really must end institutionalisation of children, because as Jan said earlier, the institutions are predominantly set up to care for children. People believe that they're doing the right thing. Sometimes children are removed from very dangerous circumstances and placed in institutions. But what we're doing is further harm. Our intentions are good, the outcomes are not. So, and there was a study in Russia that essentially found for adults who had been raised in institutions as children that they were 10 times more likely than their peers to be involved in prostitution, 40 times more likely to have a criminal record, and 500 times more likely to take their own lives. And there was a very interesting study, again about 10 years ago, but looked at, I think it was 33 European countries, and it looked at the admissions and discharges to and from institutions of children under the age of 3 across all these countries. And it found that of the discharges, 0.29% of children without disabilities had been discharged because they died, essentially. And for children with disabilities, that was 28%. So children under the age of 3 with disabilities in institutions are 100 times more likely to die than their peers. Now, this is maybe hard to believe for some people, but we have seen in many countries particularly poor staffing levels for children with disabilities in institutions. And if you have a child with disability who has an eating and drinking difficulty, and they need perhaps half an hour of support to eat a decent meal, and the staffing in the institution and the regime in the institution doesn't allow for this, this is actually one of the primary reasons why children are dying. In Bulgaria, a piece of research was done by the Bulgaria Helsinki Committee a few years ago, which found that between 2005 and 2010, I think it was 238 children had died in the disability institutions, and most of them were dying from malnutrition-related illnesses. We were asked to intervene, and we did, in 2 institutions where the mortality rates were the highest. In one of these institutions, 53 children had died in 5 years. We brought in a consultant who, the first thing she did was to observe what was happening. And essentially, every member of staff was looking after 20 children, and they were given only half an hour to feed the children. So on average, each of these children was getting 1 minute, 20 seconds to eat their meal. This is in the European Union 4 or 5 years ago. So why are outcomes for children quite so poor? Well, the key one, of course, is that children can't form an attachment, which, as we know, is essential to healthy brain development. And we see these high costs of personnel, and because of this, we see limited numbers of personnel, which means the limited time with children. We see a lot of costs of personnel in institutions that are related to running the building rather than direct care with kids. And so it's impossible to respond to individual needs, and often we will also see abusive methods of behaviour control. So if you are one member of staff looking after 20 or 30 kids, you do resort, and if they have challenging behaviours because they've been institutionalised, you do resort to sometimes some quite terrifying methods of behaviour control. The isolation from the community also means that children don't learn the basic skills to survive in the outside world, and they really struggle when they leave, and they also rarely have a family or social network when they leave the institution. And related to this, because of the lack of attachment and the lack of meaningful relationships, they are so desperate for love and affection that the first person who comes along and shows them the slightest bit of love, they would do anything for them. And this leaves them seriously at risk of sexual exploitation and trafficking. What do we mean by deinstitutionalisation? And I think this is a key issue that Jan Jajab raised earlier, that we need to have a comprehensive understanding of what this means. And I've summed it up quickly here, but the key to this is, first of all, developing the community services required to replace institutions and using those to prevent children from entering institutions, but not at any cost. So in some countries, I've seen systems where there's this idea that you just turn off the tap, you just stop admissions, irrespective of the situation of the children. So without those community-based services, we can't stop admissions to institutions. But it's also about removing every single child currently resident to family-based care in the community and leaving no child behind. And believe me, having closed a lot of institutions across Europe and beyond, it is not easy. There is always a group of children in each institution who have very, very challenging and complex needs. And unless you make an absolute commitment to finding the right placement for every single child, what we find is that authorities will say, well, look, you know, that 10, well, we'll just move them to another institution, and we re-traumatise them, and we reinforce and make worse their challenging behaviours, which makes it even more difficult for them to be placed in the future. So it's also about, and this is a really key issue that gets missed sometimes in my experience, and that is it's about ring fencing and transferring the resources. Institutions are very, very expensive to run, and when people think they don't have enough money available for community-based services, that money is caught up in the institutions. But what happens, because institutions are usually funded per child, is that as the numbers in residential care reduce, the money just disappears from the system unless we actually ring-fence the budget and make sure it's transferred across to run the community services in the future. What we find with that, if we don't undertake that, is that when we get to the most difficult placed children who need more expensive services, governments start to say, we can't afford these. We can't afford these services. But actually, they did have enough money in the institutions in the first place, but that money disappeared from the system. Very important to change attitudes, policies and practices, obviously, and the most important thing is really empowering children and families to take a lead role in changing those attitudes and those practices that affect them. So, development of foster care, I'm going to just briefly go through some examples from the UK, because foster care is a really important component of the services that we need to replace institutions. But it's not the only one, and also it is not only one model. So, as I said, I'm going to give you a couple of examples from the UK, and you can believe me that if I say anything good about the UK, it's an objective opinion, because I'm Irish, and we really don't like to admit that the English do anything well, but actually, foster care, they do very well, from my experience. And there's a whole range of different types of foster care that are needed to ensure that that we can meet the needs of a very, very wide range of children. Yeah. So emergency foster care, so children who might need somewhere to stay for a few days, this stops them from going into institutions, and it also minimises the trauma of being separated from the family, because at least if they go into a caring family environment, that will give them more stability. Short-term foster care, where children might only need care for a few weeks or months. Short breaks for children with disabilities. Remand fostering. So this is relatively new in the UK and is proving to be successful, where young people are remanded by the court to be cared for by a special foster carer, specially trained foster carer. We have long-term placements, because for some children who still have regular contacts with their own family, adoption isn't appropriate, and so long-term foster carers might be the right solution. And where possible, we try to ensure that that is with family and friends or kinship fostering. I'm just going to rush through these. Mother and baby placements. People quite often across Central and Eastern Europe set up mother and baby units as a way of preventing separation from children from their families. And guilty as charged, I set the first one up in Romania in 1993, and at the time it really was the only service in the country that was preventing admissions to institutions. But actually what we have found over the years is that if we can actually provide mother and baby foster placements, the outcomes are much better than a mother and baby unit, because very often with really young mums who are aged 13, 14, 15, they need parenting themselves in order to be able to parent well. So they're quite an important placement. And then we have these treatment foster care. This is very, very specialised and extremely well supported by a range of professionals, so that we can actually place children with some of the most complex and challenging behaviours into a foster family where they do much, much better than they do in residential care. Now, I'm just going to quickly run through a few examples of the work that Lumos has been involved in a number of different countries, just to give you some idea of what's been involved in the deinstitutionalisation process, including some of the challenges. So the Republic of Moldova, people probably know, is the poorest country in Europe by a long way. It is politically unstable. Since we've been working there, there have been 6 general elections and 1 revolution. In spite of that, we have, working with the government and many other NGOs and UNICEF, we have helped the numbers reduce very significantly by nearly 80%, the numbers of children in institutions. Now, At the same time as that, there has been a very significant rise of the number of children in foster care. But if you look at the numbers, if we go back, we were talking 10,000 children in institutions when we started. Only 850 foster carers were needed nationally because most of the children were actually able to go home to their families if family support was provided in the community. And that was the main focus of the work in Moldova, was developing that range of supports and services that would meet the needs of individual children. We, in a number of demonstration regions, you can see that the numbers of children in foster care in Yaloven and in Florești went up very dramatically once we put in place an intensive recruitment process. A key issue in Moldova, in fact, was inclusive education, because roughly 50% of the children in institutions when we started were in residential special schools because they had a disability and there was no inclusive education in the community. So developing a deinstitutionalization strategy in Moldova had to be developed at national level, hand in hand with an inclusive education strategy. And you can see that there's been this dramatic shift over the last 5 or 6 years, and in fact the number of children with disabilities separated from families and living in residential special schools has reduced by 51%, and the numbers of children with disabilities being educated in inclusive schools has gone up by 511%. Now, one of the things that made that possible in Moldova was that we managed to help the Ministry of Finance put in place a law to ring fence and transfer the funds from residential care to community-based services. And this graph here just shows you very quickly the difference in costs for an institution or a small group home, foster care and family support. And you can see that family support costs about 10% of the cost to keep a child in an institution. Now, the average stay in an institution was 12 years when we started. So if you look at the cost savings over time for the government, and then the next slide, when the government started its strategy, they had 13,000 children in institutions. Now, if they had not made any change to their system, they would have spent over 12 years 639 million euros in the poorest country in Europe. But those children cared for in the community comes to approximately 79 million euros, and we put together this analysis with the Ministry of Finance. And this made it possible for the Ministry of Education to set up inclusive education in 40% of schools in the country, and also had an impact on infant mortality. So, very briefly, an example from Bulgaria. Now, Bulgaria embarked on a massive deinstitutionalization program with amazing support from the European Commission over the last 5 years. It has not all gone well. They have made a number of mistakes that need to be put right, but a very, very significant progress has been made, and we see more than now nearly a 60% reduction of numbers of children in institutions. And the one thing that Bulgaria did that was really impressive was to start by prioritizing the children with the most severe disabilities, because the institutions they were living in had such high mortality rates that they decided to start there. Very significant increase in foster care at the same time. And what we're really seeing in Bulgaria, because of the speed of the program, is that they are reducing admissions to institutions, but they're dramatically increasing admissions to foster care. And so we're not reducing yet significantly overall the number of children in care in Bulgaria, but I'm confident that will start to happen over the next few years. Quick example from the Czech Republic. So I have a number of Czech colleagues here who I hope they won't mind my saying that it has been a challenging environment in which to work, because there was really 5-6 years ago no political will at the highest level to end institutionalization, because there was a lot of money and resource had been put into improving institutions in the Czech Republic. Czech institutions were much smaller, maximum 50 children. The buildings had been renovated. The staff had been trained, and yet we still saw really poor practices in institutions and harmful outcomes for children. But it was very difficult to get traction at the highest level. Now, I have to say that in spite of that, over the last few years, the numbers of children in institutions have really started to reduce quite significantly significantly. And most importantly, since the law was changed in 2013, the numbers of babies in institutions has reduced by 50%. So we're starting to see the beginning of the end of the system in the Czech Republic, but it really has been challenging. I'm just going to quickly show you that one of the key solutions in the Czech Republic was short-term or emergency foster care, and this has made a big, big difference because it didn't exist in the Czech Republic previously. But we've also seen very significant growth in the capacity of community-based services to support families, and because of this we're seeing dramatic reductions in the numbers of children in institutions. And if you look at the costs, again, the costs per child in different services in the Czech Republic, we see again very significantly the cost to support children to stay in their families is tiny in comparison with the cost to keep a baby in an institution. Now, an average stay in an institution for a baby is 4 months in the Czech Republic, and that costs about €7,500, and the outcomes are extremely poor because babies do not thrive in institutions, however pretty we make them look. Placing them in foster care is not much cheaper, but it is cheaper, but the outcomes are much better. But most importantly, to provide 2 years of support to a family to keep their child is so much cheaper, and it's so much better if we can keep the child out of care. So one of the things that we're trying to do in countries that have been relying heavily on institutions is, if you like, is to invert this triangle, where a lot of money and resource has been put into institutions and very little put into the support to family and community-based services. So we're trying to turn that upside down. That essentially is what we mean by the transfer of resources, but it's very challenging because of all the resistance that there is to change a system. I'm very briefly going to just talk about some outcomes, and this was from a study done on some foster care in Moldova that showed very, very significant improvements in the physical and cognitive development of children after they moved out of institutions and into foster care. And this was not the best foster care I've ever seen, I have to be honest. But we also saw very significant reductions in behaviours that were quite challenging for children, such as self-harming and aggression, stealing, lying, etc. Behaviours that are common to children who are institutionalised, behaviours that make it very difficult for them to integrate into the community later on. And so seeing these behaviours change very significantly is really important. Some of the mistakes that we see made in development of foster care, particularly if we try to do it rapidly, inappropriate recruitment, so not having in place rigorous enough recruitment policies and just essentially taking anybody who wants to be a foster carer. Inadequate preparation and inadequate matching processes, and also seeing foster care as a solution for all children. It isn't. And we need to have this range of solutions to meet the needs of individual children. But also we can see overly rigid regulations that can make it difficult to provide the different kinds of foster care that we need. I've also seen in a number of countries foster care restricted only to children whose parents have been deprived of parental rights, which means there's a whole swathe of kids who stay in institutions who could be in foster care simply because of the law, but also giving parents the right to choose the type of placement for their child. What's happening here is parents don't want their children to go into foster care because they don't want them to attach to another family, but we know that that's what they need, and that putting them in an institution is going to harm them. So we also see that children with disabilities are quite often excluded from foster care, and we also see insufficient remuneration. I just want to say that we've seen this amazing progress in the EU regarding the structural funds regulations, and we've seen earlier on all of the countries that are starting to treat this as a priority because of the work that everyone's doing together. But I wanted just to say that I'd like us all to think as well about beyond the European Union. As a union, we are the biggest donor internationally to international development and aid, and we should make sure that the standards that we set for Europe's children are the standards for all children. If it isn't good enough for children to be in institutions in Europe, it's not good enough for them to be in institutions anywhere. So we need to make sure that our taxes that are being used for international aid and development are used in the best way and are not used to reinforce institutions. And also to coordinate in that way with what's happening in the wider humanitarian aid and development field. I want to make just one last point. in a lot of residential care, people try very, very, very hard. I worked there myself. I tried very hard to provide really good care for the children I was working with. But I think that if this isn't going to sound too trite, the problem is that children need love, and love can only be provided in a family. It is love that makes the brain develop. It is love that helps these children to be secure in the community, and love does not go home at the end of a shift. Thanks very much.
Paldies, Mulheras kundzei, par apjomīgu.
Thank you, Ms. Mujer, for this broad presentation, which introduced us to various practices in other countries, and we also had the opportunity to see mistakes that we might take into account. The next speaker will be Ms. Anne Kilai, Head of Department at the Estonian Ministry of Social Affairs. She represents also the expert group for coordination on children at risk. And she will speak about challenges of the Baltic Sea states in providing family support and quality alternative care. The floor is yours.
We could easily skip my presentation because many things have been said already in the morning's presentation and also now, but I'm not giving up so easily. So I will try to do my best to feed you in with some more perspectives and information. And as you said, I'm sitting on 2 chairs. I'm representing Estonian Ministry of Social Affairs here, but also the Council of the Baltic Sea States and the Cooperation on Children at Risk within the network of the Baltic Sea region. So I will share my thoughts on 2 aspects. First, introducing some initial results from the regional study on alternative care and family support in the Baltic Sea region, and also introducing the Italian recommendation and action plan on alternative care and family support for the Baltic Sea region, which was endorsed by the expert meeting in Tallinn in the beginning of May by the 11 representatives of 11 member states represented in the expert meeting, and also representatives from UK, actually. So I will tell you more about that. And I will skip many slides, just to warn you, because many things have been already said, and this is good. For you who don't know the cooperation within the region, we have 11 member states in the Council of the Baltic Sea States. So EU members, including also Norway, Iceland, and Russia, and we also have Germany and Poland and all the Baltic Sea states and Nordic countries part of the cooperation. And the EU Commission is also observer of this cooperation. And the expert group for cooperation on children at risk has been operating within the CBSS network since the beginning of 2000. So we have quite a wide experience in cooperating. And one of the priority fields for the cooperation has been children's rights and alternative care. So this has been one of the fields we have been working on. We've decided to prepare a regional study to compare the situation and to see where we are in the region on alternative care and family support. And as the Minister of Social Protection in a pre-word of the study says, we have to look at the mirror. We have to really see and face the challenges what we are having. We have very many different experiences in the regions. We have new states, so-called new states, who have been building the systems just about 20 years. And we have those countries who have had this possibility for decades or hundreds of years. So we are in a different platforms, but in a way we are facing that we have many similarities at the same time. The key themes and questions. Key themes for the regional study were first, prevention of family separation, then transition from institutional to family-based care, the core issue for today, and safeguarding children's rights in alternative care. So we were exploring what to provide international standards, how are they implemented and translated into national laws, legislation frameworks, what are the good practices in the region and which challenges are remained and how to face them. So we also see many recommendations and policy suggestions in a study for all regional countries. So some numbers. In this number you see the total child population in out-of-home care in CBSS region, and those children who are placed in residential care and those who are in family-based care. The number at this picture is that 57% of children are placed in family-based care. This number is without Russia. This number is together with Germany. When we saw first the numbers, then we were quite happy because when we didn't have Germany's numbers, it was 71% placement to family-based care in the regions, without Germany and without Russia. When we added Germany's numbers here, we saw the very huge decrease. And why is that? Germany does not have any official policy or strategy what really prioritizes the issue of placement of children into family-based care. So they are only following the best interest principle. And that shows us clearly how important it is to have policies, guidelines, standards, practices in place, also implemented in the law and the strategies. So what was said earlier today also, that we need a clear strategy, especially those countries who are facing the transition from the institutions to family-based care. You can see also the comparison from different countries in the region, and there you see that the only country who has more placement into institutions is Germany, and other countries are actually doing not so bad at all, who we have here in the picture, including Baltic states. So as you can see, Latvia is having quite good number on family placement, and also Estonia and Norway are here in the front row. Yeah. So the general number in children in alternative care, the percentage of total child population under 18 years old, we see that the medium in the region, again we don't have Russian figures here, it is 1.22% children in alternative care. Unfortunately, I cannot say good news to Latvia. You have 2.3% of children in alternative care of the general population, but still we can see that the situation in the region is not, in general, so bad. I will skip those now and will move to Tallinn recommendation. We had regional expert meeting on alternative care and family support in Tallinn in 5 and 6 May 2015. Some of you were there attending. And there were government representatives, experts, professionals from Baltic Sea region and UK. And we endorsed the Tallinn recommendations, and you will find that on the website, you can see on the slide. And this is policy recommendations for the countries. And this is something really what gives both regionally and nationally focus where to head to, because the recommendations are basing on a study what I just described, and of the results of the study, of the challenges what we face, and also the policy recommendations what we find from the study. But during the meeting, we added some more suggestions to the recommendations. So this is, I would say, a good document for the region, and it might be also giving some interest to others. Yeah, I have many sentences in the slides, but just quoting to some of those. We have many points in a recommendation which sets clear guidances and also some actions which are recommended. So in the regional level, as I mentioned, we have the regional expert group cooperating on children at risk. For the regional level, we can do a lot to promote progressive transition from institutional to family-based care in the regional cooperation, because as we saw, there is a lot to learn from each other, even from those countries who have had like long history doing the work compared to those who don't. but it's important to learn from the mistakes of others, what they have made, and really integrate into your system those good practices, what you can learn. So this is the advantage also, and this is why we do need regional cooperation. We've had quite practical cooperation within the region. For instance, we have developed a tool for monitoring of alternative care institutions of children. It's called AuTrain, and it's based on system-based auditing method, which is supporting institutions to do better to secure rights of children in the institutions. Because usually we see in the countries that quite many countries are doing inspections. They are measuring square meters and how many children are there and if they are properly fed and so on. But we really have to see the rights of the children in the institution. And this tool is really helping us to do that. Integrated service models have been mentioned here today. We know in the region that we have quite a good practices actually also. In Norway, for instance, and also in Sweden, there are family houses which provide families integrated service models. So that means the families with small children can go for the health checkups and up to the therapy or parenting schools, whatever they need in the one place. And we have good evidence that this really works and supports parents. Strengthen the capacity of service providers to prevent family separation. Prevention is something where we all have huge challenges. We have to do better than we do now. This is something we have not really taken as seriously as we should, both politically and also financially, because we don't invest into prevention as we should. Though we know that evidence demonstrates that prevention has really good outcome for children, and we should really do that. Like home visits, what's been mentioned today here, positive parenting skills. Estonia has been deciding to invest into positive parenting program incredible years. I know that Latvia is also exploring that. So this is the way to go. This is where we should be heading to. What we also discussed in the expert meeting, what really matters to the child is the relationship with the adult, the secure relationship. The best outcomes from the children who have been placed into alternative care comes from those either institutions or families where there is long-term relationship, emotional relationship, and stability between the child and adult. So this is what we have to keep in our mind. We have to respect children and caregivers as competent partners. User involvement, this is also the key to provide quality service. We really have to learn from the needs of the children. It was very well described before how we have to tailor-make the services. But we really have to do it seriously and take into account their needs and to hear the voices. It was already mentioned by my previous speaker here, but we should really ensure financing allocated to residential institutions is redirected to policies and services for family support and quality alternative care when institutions are being closed down. This is one of the policy recommendations for the region, and this is really what we have to do and use. And building more focus also on children with special needs when we are talking about, for instance, corporal punishment, because children with disabilities are facing more corporal punishment than those who don't have disabilities because of their vulnerability. They don't report of their experiences, or they really don't defend themselves as they could. So we have to take that into account also when we promote non-violent approaches within the services. And provide continuity of care for families and children at risk who move. And they move within national borders and they move internationally across the borders. So really we have to follow the children and the families, and we have to support them in order to prevent family separation or provide adequate care for them as well. So to conclude, we have many recommendations, we have many guidelines, we have many strategies, but we have to implement that. So let's start with implementation and let's take the recommendations and policy guidances seriously. This is my message here today. Thank you.
Paldies, Lajas kundzei, un es jau...
Thank you, Ms. Lai. As I promised, you will have some time for some discussion at the end. We have 9 minutes time. So, dear participants in the hall, you have the opportunity to ask some questions. There are mics available. You seem tired and expecting lunch. If you have no questions, I will use the opportunity to ask the concluding question on my part, which might be a little bit provocative, and Mr. Halloran is asked to answer, probably. At the end of your presentation, you said we had to start working, and opinions differ on the question whether people with disabilities can live within the community. And there are states that are not ready to return people with disabilities to the community. International researchers advise to start the DI process with those people who have the most serious disabilities. My question is, what is your opinion on this? Because there are some radical views, and some people think that these people with very serious disabilities should stay in the institutions. What should we start with?
I think it's an important question, because there are those who have the opposite view, that you should almost demonstrate the effectiveness of your deinstitutionalization by actually moving those with least disabilities. I think the opposite. I think that the evidence shows that, in fact, this is a process of hearts and minds. It's a process of actually making some serious change. And therefore, I think you have to start from a point of view, whether it's a rights-based approach, that says people have a right to live in the community. Therefore, we need to actually go about making sure that can happen. And if people have complex needs, let's find some solutions that work for them. But I think the danger is you end up with a process that takes forever, and you actually never tackle the issue, because the assumption made, and it's not just for disabled people, it's for a whole range of people with whom we work in the community, that there are some people who will always need very specialist schools, specialist hospitals, specialist psychiatric institutions, specialist whatever. And to some extent, you have to make sure you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, as was said earlier, that you have to actually look at individual needs and not presume what people might need in advance. But nevertheless, you have to have an approach, I think, that says everybody has the right to be as independent as possible, to have their voice heard, and we need to actually address, if we're going to deinstitutionalize seriously, those with the most complex needs. And I think that's just fundamental. And I think the danger of not doing that, as I said, is that we will end up with institutions in 10 years' time, 15 years' time.
Paldies. Es domāju, tas ir mums
Thank you. I think this is food for thought for us, also for the work groups. If there are no questions, there are some questions indeed.
Luc Zelderlo, Secretary General, ESPD, European Association of Service Providers for Persons with Disabilities. I would like to pick up something that was touched by some of the panelists. Deinstitutionalization is, of course, about children. It's, of course, about persons with disabilities, elderly, homeless. But maybe it is much more about the type of society we want to live in. We focus maybe too much on these groups and not enough on the type of society we want to live in and whether this society is able to value diversity. That is the key issue, I think. And when you look at things from that perspective, then you see that support services, of course, they are important and they have a very important responsibility. But not only the support services are responsible for creating an inclusive society, for creating a society that is valuing diversity. All other actors in society are equally responsible. And we should focus on that much more, I think, if we want to develop a more inclusive society. It's about youth organizations, it's about the cultural sector, it's about the business world, it's about so many other aspects of life and actors in society. And my question to Michelle, I would like to thank you for your very interesting presentation, is in the design of the support, how do you activate, work with other actors in society that are not from the disability silo, bubble, excuse me for use that word, because that's a bit the world we live in, or the children's sector, or the elderly field. How do you work with other actors in society to make sure that we work towards a more inclusive society? Thank you.
Do you want me to answer that? Because it's a really good question, and I don't think anybody's got the answer yet to that. But it's about thinking. One of the things that we are doing is thinking about how can non-paid people have a real role in building community. So one of the things that we are building, although I do a lot of work supporting providers and services, is thinking outside of that and thinking about what's the role of community. So one of the things that we're doing is building community circles around people that are holding providers and commissioners to account. So one of the things that we are doing is thinking that actually services have a really important function, but not the only important function out there. So building community has to be one of the things that we're continually working on. But it's a long, hard process, I think. But it starts with me, and it starts with you, and it starts with Georgette, and it starts with every single one of us who has an absolute responsibility to focus on building community. So I have a real bugbear about people who say community is not what it used to be. Well, if it's not what it used to be, what are we going to make it?
Could I just add in? I think absolutely, Luke, it is the crucial question. Obviously, this is the area that I work in, but I think a really important place to start is with the children, and particularly in schools and kindergartens. So if it's absolutely normal from age 3 that there are disabled 3-year-olds beside non-disabled 3-year-olds and they're all friends, then that changes the sort of society we live in, very much as John was saying, from his experience, his grandchildren, to them this is just completely normal that there are disabled children at a concert dancing around having fun. And I wanted briefly to say, in terms of just 2 examples of that. So the inclusive education in Moldova that I talked about, that of course just does not happen overnight. And it involved training about 14,000 professionals, but also it involved lots of community meetings with parents from villages who didn't want disabled children and children from institutions coming into their schools. There was a lot of hostility to start with in communities, and that transformed itself to the extent that groups of non-disabled children in schools in Moldova, when they found out about inclusive education and what it meant, they said, well, we want to help. And so they set up groups within their schools to support their colleagues when they came in for the first time to school from having been in an institution for many years. And some of the kids, the first inclusive school we were involved in helping to develop, some of the children who'd come out of this absolutely appalling institution, I asked them, what was it like on your first day? Were you a bit scared, and how did the other kids react? And they said, well, we were a bit scared. We thought that they might not be nice to us, but actually they greeted us with cherries. They stood at the gates of their school with bowls of cherries and said, welcome to our school. And this was a community that a few months before had been very hostile to the idea. Now that group in Moldova has now become about 500 children with and without disabilities in schools across the countries who are telling their schools, their communities and the government that they need to make inclusive education happen across the country. And this is part of what has made it possible. Second thing I just wanted to say is in Bulgaria also we've been supporting a group of children and young people with intellectual disabilities to find their voices and to advocate for themselves and others. And there is a National Children's Council in Bulgaria that has a quota of disabled children. So everybody else on that council is voted onto it by popular vote by kids in schools in their community. But there's a quota for disabled children. Well, one of the young men that we work with, a 15-year-old boy called Veliko, who about 4 or 5 years ago when we started working with him, even his mother thought that he couldn't really speak, was actually elected to that council by popular vote, and this is the first time that a disabled child was elected by popular vote of the children from his schools and communities. They felt that he was the best one to represent them. And so these, I think, you know, we have to put effort and time and energy into really empowering children and families and the most disadvantaged. But when we do, they're the ones who transform society for us.
Paldies. Es tiešām negribu nozagt jūsu laiku no pusdienām, but I see that Jan Pfeiffer has a microphone.
The last point, Jan Pfeiffer, Mental Europe. I want to ask everybody, we talk more about new member states, and it seems like it's a problem of new member states, but what about the old member states? Yeah. What about the old member states? We are talking about West and East, you know. What about West? That, if you can mention a little bit, it's really a problem only of new member states or not, and it's a problem of all European Union. And also, it's quite a lot that the East is learning from the West. Is it also other way around? Is already some examples where the West can learn from the East?
I'm glad you raised that, because I was hoping to get a moment to say exactly the same thing, that I think the point that came from the last lady speaking about the Council of the Baltic States opened a window onto this question for us, really, which is, and I think Danuta was telling me earlier when organising this meeting, it was difficult to get people from West European countries to come. So I think this is an issue, and I wonder how we take it forward, because clearly there's a long way to go in terms of how West European countries address a number of these issues. So this is not a Central and East European issue itself, pure and simple. And we must learn, because you've made quite radical progress here already. And I think what's happening is that whilst there's no one solution for every country, the fact that people are committed to making this kind of change opens up innovation and thinking in a whole range of environments where there are going to be financial restrictions on what you can do. So I think we all need to actually do a bit of sharing of learning on this. And I hope that we should be able to take the message back to some of our own countries, not just the ones that were mentioned by the Baltic states. I think an interesting point on Germany, but also in other countries too, where we can ask quite pointed questions about, for example, the number of children in alternative family care.
Paldies. Nu, gan man jāsaka, ka vēl kāds...
I can
just very shortly, sorry.
Yes. I don't have much to add, but this is true what the previous speaker said, that we have to learn from each other. In the region, this is a good opportunity to do that. And also to have the strength to say that, especially for those younger countries from the Baltics, for instance, that we actually have good practice as well. We have to really see that and also use this good practice. For instance, we have quite good system of kinship care. And this is something we should really build on something. So we don't have to necessarily to build more foster homes, institutions, which would be really fantastic, but we can use this what we have. So this is exactly, and the Germany's example, this is exactly what you asked. We are actually performing better than them in this sense when it concerns the numbers.
Could I just very briefly say, I think one of the challenges we face is that the main instrument that we have that has been making this shift now from institutions and this transition to community-based services is the structural and investment funds. And that's a fantastic move forward, but of course the countries that don't really use much in terms of structural investment funds are therefore sort of left out of this movement. So there is a need for something at European level, which is a Europe-wide policy directive or something, not being an EU expert, but I think that that the structural funds are a fantastic mechanism, a fantastic tool, but it does mean it's easier for countries like Germany and Belgium and France to abdicate responsibility for moving on this issue.
Paldies. Nu, es izmantošu savas moderatora tiesības un
now I will make use of my moderator's right, and I would like to announce that this panel is over. Thank you ever so much to all the presenters for your contribution. Now a number of household matters. We are all going to go to have lunch on the ground floor, and at 1 o'clock you need to go to your work groups, and you have chosen them already. First, 102, room 102. Group 2 in the hall, Kurzeme, and the third group on successful models will be on the ground floor 2, the hall Jura. Thank you ever so much, and welcome to lunch, and I expect you to be back at 3 o'clock in your own groups. Thank you.